Yeah. I mean, you know, there's often this question asked, who can follow Joe Stiglitz's act? And we have the perfect person for that. Just about the only person I know, which is Ravi Kanbur. And Ravi has been, I'm sure you all know of him, my reputation, so I won't go into great details except to mention a couple of things. Ravi has been very kindly a regular sort of participant, attendee, given lectures every year at the advanced graduate workshops. So he's one of the constants of the AGW. Can't imagine it without him. Ravi also, of course, apart from a very distinguished academic career, through which you probably all know him, one of those rare breeds of people who was at the World Bank for many years and did work both on the kind of all the research side of the bank, did a lot of research when he was there, and did just about the most operational type of job you can, being a country director, heading the World Bank's office in Ghana and Accra. So it was a kind of an unusual combination. He managed to still get some research done while I was doing all the bureaucratic stuff that those kinds of people do. So it's a real, and so he really has in that sense, you know, great practical sense, unity of theory of praxis is what Ravi reflects on most other things. Thank you, Ravi.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Akbar, and it's a great pleasure to be here. What Akbar neglected to mention is that I'm a student of Joe Stiglitz, so I can't say no to him. So, well, what I thought I'd do for this, is this a bit loud? Yeah. You know, I have reasonable voice for development. There are a number of papers that I've written over the last few years, and you can get those on my website. But what I thought I'd do here is to take a broad approach, raise some questions, raise some issues, point out what I think are interesting research areas, so that we can then have a discussion. And what would be good and useful is if you just interrupt as we're going along, okay? No, rather than I just talk for an hour and then. So if there's anything that's not clear, if there's anything that's interesting to you and so on, just raise the question. So, I mean, you can't go very far in development economics, certainly, and in development studies in general, without coming across the terms formality and informality. And they're usually related to some sort of concept of the dual economy, two sectors, one advanced, one backward, one this, one that. There's all that sort of stuff in the literature, and it's a very distinguished literature, very long literature. And I suppose 5-10 years ago, one began to get the feeling that maybe it's run its course. You know, we've said just about everything that we can about informality. But actually, in the last 5 to 10 years, it's come back very strongly. And the reason is that informality, far from declining with development, has actually been increasing in the last 15 to 20 years. One of the great sort of stylized predictions of the development literature 25 years ago, 30 years ago, was that as development proceeds, informality, and we're going to talk about how to define it, conceptualize it, measure it, etc., informality, somehow defined, would decline with development. In fact, it would be a measure of development that informality was declining. And indeed it did for a while. But for the last 15 to 20 years, it's not declining. If anything, it's increasing in some countries. So that's led to a tremendous increase in interest again in this issue. Policymakers are very interested in it because they thought of informality as being an indicator of development. So if it's not declining, declining informality is being an indicator of development. So if it's not declining, we're not developing. So they're worried as hell about it. Okay. And analysts are saying, well, how come it's not declining when it should be declining? We predicted it, etc. So both from the analysis point of view and from the policy point of view, this is a very interesting and important area. As I said, it's a very broad area, and I'm going to just pick a few areas and to highlight, and sort of we'll take it from there. So that's the rough outline. So, why are we interested in informality? Here are some reasons. this is the sort of quote that you find in all sorts of policy documents. Informal sector employment and underemployment have aggravated urban poverty. In other words, a close connection between informality and poverty. Informality is a prominent feature of urban landscape. There's a strong association between poverty and informality. And as I said, with development, urbanization is meant to increase and informality is meant to decline. Urbanization has indeed increased. Informality has not declined. So of these two great stylized facts, these stylized predictions of development, one seems to have come true, one seems to be happening, the other one not. Actually, an interesting question is, are those two facts related? Is the fact that urbanization is accelerating closely linked to the fact that informality is not declining? That's another interesting analytical question that we might pose. And as I said, finally, there are very different views on policy responses to informality. Deregulate, one group says, another group says, no, what you need is even more state regulation because there's so much informality, informality is increasing. So one group says, you stupid, informality advisors. I can probably guess after you've asked the question.
Why is there an established correlation or connection between urbanization and informality?
Well, there isn't. That's not the issue. But I was thinking about two separate correlations. Okay? If you do two separate cross-country plots, one of urbanization against per capita GNP, urbanization increases. That you see that in cross-country plot. Then you do a cross-country plot of informality somehow measured against per capita GNP. That's a declining relationship. Okay, and that's where things stood 15 years ago. The point is that first prediction, so to speak, has actually happened. The second prediction has not happened. Why? That's the question. And if your question is, what might be the intricate relationships between urbanization and informality, that we'll come to. We'll discuss. That's the issue we can discuss. Those are some papers that you can look up on my website. So we all talk about informality, but actually there is no consistent, coherent definition, conceptualization, etc., etc. In this volume, Vasudev Kasnobis, myself, and Eleanor Ostrom, the late Eleanor Ostrom, looked at different definitions and said essentially there's no consistency, there's no coherence in the way that we talk about informality in the literature. So let me talk a little bit about the different strands in the literature of how informality is conceptualized. Okay. Going back, and as I said, it's closely linked to the ideas of the dual economy. So the first type of conceptualization of this comes actually in the work of the Dutch anthropologist Burke, who was actually a anthropologist and colonial administrator in the Dutch East Indies. And he developed the notion, the term, the dual economy, actually comes from Burke. And he developed this notion, he had his mind picture of a wall. On this side of the wall was the colonial administration, well-ordered, laws, rules, etc., etc. On that side of the wall was the rest of the economy. The other bit, that was the other dual of this economy. And the phrase that was used was glimpsed in silhouettes and shadows. Okay? It's something out there which you can't see. It's chaos, disorder. You can't really. On this side, of course, the rules, regulations, laws, etc., etc. So the notion of the formal sector as being organized, as having rules and regulations and so on, and the informal sector as being chaotic and disorder, etc., is something which is very strong in the literature. It's certainly there in the development studies literature. It's actually also there in the development economics literature in the way that economists model these things and so on, as we'll see. If we then move on from the 1940s to the 1950s and come to sort of Arthur Lewis and his notion of the dual economy, essentially for him, there was an advanced sector and a backward sector. And the backward sector is essentially the reserve army of labor. It's that sector which supplies the labor as the advanced sector advances. And because there's surplus labor, there's a reserve army of labor, that keeps wages down, and so on. And of course, you can see as development, quote-unquote, development takes place, as investment takes place in the advanced sector, jobs increase there, labor is drawn, so the informal sector, quote-unquote, declines, the formal sector increases. The classic prediction that informality will decline as development proceeds. So, and the informal sector, the traditional sector, in the Lewis case, doesn't necessarily have to be rural. It can also be in the urban sector, as it says, the whole range of casual jobs, the workers in the docks, the young men who rush forward asking you to carry your bag as you appear, the jobbing gardener, and the like. So for him, the rural, the urban informal was all one as a piece, and the real distinction was between the advanced sector, the capitalist sector, where there's a capitalist mode of production, and the traditional, quote-unquote, traditional sector. Yes?
In his writings, did he explicitly mention reserve army of labor, or is it your definition?
He did not mention reserve army of labor, but people have used it.
Yeah.
But what he did say is that his whole object was to restore what he called the classical mode of thinking in development. And by the classical mode of thinking, he meant, Ricardo, he meant that strain of thinking. It would have been unusual for Lewis to mention Marx in any great detail. Some of you may know the reasons. So we now move to the 1970s, and certainly in terms of the economics literature. And here's many of you are familiar with this, a classic piece of work, Harris Tadaro, and early Tadaro. And this model and this way of thinking is absolutely central in development economics and in development economics policy. So the worldview, and see how it relates back to Booker and Lewis and so on. So the worldview is that there are these two sectors. There's the formal sector, where there are regulations, the minimum wage, etc., which keeps the wage above the market clearing level. Labor is displaced from here, and it goes into this other sector where the wage adjusts to clear the labor market. Okay? So here's a view which says that the formal sector is the one where there are regulations, distortions, blah, blah, blah. The informal sector is the one where there's competition, no market power, wages adjust to clear, etc. So this distinction between two sectors, in one of which there is regulation, the other of which there is not, and moreover, implicitly, that regulation is inefficient, is a very, very strong part, is a very strong structuring element in the way development economists think about it. In fact, development policymakers think about this. Okay. So the conclusion, if you want to reduce informality, deregulate, essentially follows from this type of framework. Why? Because you have two sectors, in one of which you now introduce regulation, one of which you now put the wage above the market clearing level. That displaces workers from here into this, therefore increasing the size of the quote-unquote informal sector. You want to reduce the size of the informal sector? Well, remove this regulation. They'll all flow back in here. Okay. And that mindset, that mind picture is very important in the way that policymakers and policy analysts think about this. So here's some other strands in the literature. Actually, the term formal sector and informal sector, many people would argue, can be attributed to Hart, where in his work in Ghana, a country that I know reasonably well, he assessed incomes and so on in a particular slum area of Accra. And he had a sort of Weberian notion of what constitutes order and not. Okay. And he said that formal incomes, this is his definition. He said, these people are earning income from all different sources, etc., etc. But formal incomes come from regulated economic activities. And informal incomes lay beyond the scope of regulation. Okay. And this notion that formality is something to do with state regulation, and informality is something to do with being outside the purview of state regulation. Which is, you can see how that sort of fits into the Burker conception and so on and so forth, But that's a very important specification of that. Okay. Specify your regulation. Those activities which come within the purview of this regulation are formal. Those activities which are outside the purview of this regulation or are illegal because they're not following the regulation are informal. Okay. So this is another strand in the literature of formality and informality. See, all these things are close, are related, overlapping, etc., but there's no consistent, coherent definition coming out of this. But what's important about this is that, in fact, the statistical definitions of formality and informality, the numbers on the basis of which we say informality is declining or not, etc., actually follow this type of hard type notion. Okay? Because the way that we convert the notion of formality and informality into a measurable concept, the way that we convert the relationship to regulation to a measurable concept, is that you say, well, we'll specify the regulation, and we're going to look at enterprises which satisfy those regulations, which come under the purview of the regulation. And those we will call formal, and the others we will call informal. And that, in fact, is the standard way in which the statistics operate at the ILO and the Indian statistics, everywhere, really, basically. So here's the ILO definition. They're enterprises owned by individuals or households that are not constituted as separate legal entities. That's where the regulation comes in. If you're not constituted as a separate legal entity, i.e. you don't have a relationship to the law, the formal law, and for which no complete accounts are available, then you're informal. And that actually is the core of how we get the numbers on informality. Essentially, when you look at standardized ILO statistics, the basic concept is we look at whether enterprises are incorporated or not, and we measure the number of workers in those enterprises, and that is the informal workers in the economy.
Sorry?
Please.
How do you get the number of informal workers?
Well, so suppose we do an enterprise survey. We do an enterprise survey, and for each enterprise, I have two pieces of information. Okay. Is it registered or not? And I also know how many workers there are in that enterprise. So I simply count up. I'm very loosely, okay. I know there are very differences between. I simply count up all the workers in the enterprises that are registered, and that is my formal labor force. Okay. You raise an interesting question as to how do I get my informal labor force. It's in fact 100% minus that. Okay. So I have some other estimate of the labor force from elsewhere, okay, from population, etc., etc. And that actually, you raise a good point, and we're going to come back to that. That in fact, what we really have a handle on, in as far as you can have a handle on this, is actually the number of workers in the formal enterprises, because that's what you actually measure. Okay. What we measure informality as is 100% minus that. Okay. And you'll see that that's an issue, because in fact, well, you'll see why that's an issue.
Out of your legal curiosity, Columbia Law School, where do you join journalists? Journalists, for example, lawyers, consultants, investment bankers, those who are not incorporated but are certainly regulated. Where did they fall in?
So, according to this definition, it's an incorporated enterprise definition. Okay. So you would not count in that. Okay?
Right, exactly. So,
but and again, you raise another point, which is that there are other regulations which apply. Okay. So suppose there are 7 regulations which apply. Okay. But of course, 3 of those might apply to this, 4 of those might apply to that, etc., etc. How do I now construct a measure of formality or informality when there are multiple regulations? That's a conceptual problem, but it has no statistical counterpart. It's straightforwardly whether enterprises are incorporated or not. That's the definition that's used.
right. So incorporation, non-incorporation happens a lot in small services.
Yes, no, you're right. You're right.
That's a major.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No. Yeah, that's a major statistical issue. Okay. So the correlation between informality and poverty that I mentioned earlier, okay, is still a correlation, but of course the one person who's out there with a satellite dish interacting with Silicon Valley is actually doing rather well for himself, and that doesn't. Yeah. So these are good points, and so the heterogeneity in the informal sector is something that a point that is raised quite a lot in the literature also. But in terms of broad trends and broad numbers.
And of course, there could be incorporated enterprises which don't obey all regulation.
Okay, so you now see you're all jumping ahead, which is good. Which is good. Yeah, absolutely. So suppose I have an incorporated enterprise, okay. And suppose that incorporated enterprises, let's take the Indian case. Okay, the Indian case is enterprises with 10 or more workers are meant to register. And with registration come certain responsibilities. For example, paying a minimum wage, let's say. So suppose an enterprise is incorporated, but is not paying the minimum wage. How do I count that? That's another interesting statistical conundrum that one faces. And in fact, yeah, again, you're jumping ahead, but you see that many people have argued for a broadening of the definition of informality. Not only workers in unincorporated enterprises, but workers in incorporated enterprises who are not receiving certain types of benefits. That would obviously then expand the number of workers who are informal. But then how do you measure that is an interesting question. Okay. Well, how would you measure it? Well, the way that you would do it, for example, you would go not through the enterprise survey route, you would go through the household survey route. So the enterprise survey route is you go to enterprises and you say, are you registered, are you whatever, etc., etc. And obviously that guy's not going to tell you whether he's obeying the minimum wage laws or not. But for household surveys, you go to a household, you find a respondent, and you say, where are you working? What is your sector, what is your etc., etc., where are you working? How many workers are there in your enterprise? Do you have a written contract? Do you have a whatever, etc.? And from that route, you can then build up the number of workers who should have these benefits but don't. So that's a statistical. Okay. So we've covered quite a few things that I was going to cover anyway. So this is the point that India's National Commission on Employment in the Unorganized Sector made the distinction which we've been talking about just now. They said the informal sector consists of all unincorporated private enterprises with less than 10 total workers. That's the thing that we've been talking about. Informal workers consists of those working in the informal sector, okay, and the workers in the formal sector without any employment and social security benefits provided by the employer. So this is the Indian National Commission broadening the definition of informality. So, another strand. We're up to now, we talked about the ILO strand, the formality, informality, unincorporated enterprise, etc. Here's another strand in the literature. This is De Soto's notion of that things that are under the umbrella of the law are formal. Things that are outside the umbrella of the law are informal. And his iconic statement is that there's $1 trillion of equity tied up in urban slums. What does he mean by that? What he means by that is if only somehow these urban slums could be used for collateralization. In other words, somehow if you could extend the reach of the legal system into the urban slums, provide them a platform for using their property as collateral for credit, etc., etc., this would lead to a huge revolution and so on. Okay, that's a very much the De Soto. And the argument here is again harks back a little bit to Bokar, which is that things are chaotic in the informal sector. It's difficult to write contracts in the informal sector. Okay? But here on this side, formal, clean. Okay, if somebody reneges on the contract, you take them to the courts, and the courts work well, and etc. etc. So the De Soto view has strong links back to the Bokar view of on that side of the wall chaos, on this side of the wall order as a perspective. So, what's the basic conclusion is that there is actually no clear and consistent conceptualization. Each strand in the literature highlights one or other aspect. And these aspects are present in the policy discourse as well, as we'll see when we get onto the policy discussion. But what I want to do in the next few slides is to take one aspect of this and follow it through. Perhaps a useful generalization is that formal, quote unquote formal, is something that relates to coming within the ambit of state regulation. I'll do it in a second. And all the questions you've been asking actually leaves a lot of leeway. Regulation of what? Of what type? If there are many regulations, do you have to comply with all of them? What if you comply with 5 out of the 7, 6 out of the 8? Well, what does that do? Well, measurement of informality requires further specification, as I said, as does policy now. Yes, you had a question.
I think there's a more fundamental question. This is just with my ignorance.
Sure.
Which is, why do we even need this lens in the first place? I mean, if informality is as a kind of guide that tells us poverty or development or the reach of interventions, why don't we just go measure poverty? And what does this do for us?
Well, two things, and again, very good question. Two things. Firstly, everybody has been worrying about this, okay, for the last 50 years. So my colleague Gary Fields has got so frustrated with this that he said we should ban the term informality altogether. We should not talk about it, because there are at least 3 definitions every time you mention informality. Okay? But of course, you can't. It's now so ingrained in our thinking, okay, that even Gary himself says we must ban informality, and then he goes on to talk about, use the term informality the way that he means it. Okay. So first of all, I don't think there's any way out of the use of this term, of being clear about what people mean, etc. Because the moment you go into a policy discourse, people will be talking about informality. Okay, in this. Secondly, and this is where we're going to talk about policy aspects to it, okay, there is a strong policy dimension to this. Because if you take the view, and this is why the particular line that I'm taking, I think is important. If you take the view that informality is related to regulation, if you take the view of informality to regulation, then obviously it becomes important to know how regulations affect the informality and so on. Okay? So you could say, no, I don't want to use the term. I just want to look at the effect of regulation. Fine, but really what you're doing is looking at informality as conventionally talked about. Yes, please.
Is there a sense historical, it seems historical, that there's this connection or linkage between informality and poverty studies or development studies, and yet it's just as prevalent in any sort of quote-unquote developed or higher income environment. So why is it that this discourse or the lens is uniquely applied to looking at the study of lower income economies?
Well, again, 20 years ago, you could see why. Okay. 20 years ago, if you were to plot this thing, okay, as a cross-section plot, you would see a strong decline in informality as a function of per capita GNP. Okay. Now, that cross-section as a time series prediction is no longer kind of true, and actually in developed countries also, it is no longer happening, and that's a good point. So the question is whether there's some sort of uniformity now developing, whether we can conceptualize these things in the same way. But certainly in the development literature, 20 years ago, I think it would have been reasonable. It would have been a reasonable position to take 20 years ago, looking at all the time trends at that time, looking at the levels in developed countries versus developing countries, that this is where you would be going over time. But that has not happened, and that's the point.
Do you think that's related, though, to the observances of that which was captured 20 years ago in terms of what we were looking at, both in sort of lower income and higher income environments? Maybe it arose by any other name, in the sense in a higher income environment, and we simply weren't seeking to measure the types of informality that we assume to measure, or assume to look for in the lower income economies. So I feel like even that 20 years ago, I agree with you in terms of the trajectory that we see, and the facts are there, but for me it also, I would argue that it would relate to the measurement issues and what we sought to measure and what we could measure, what was observable, and our understanding of that which is measurable or relevant has changed.
Well, okay, these are all fair points. It's not, so certainly till 20th, actually till 10 years ago, the definition of, the cross-national definition of informality, at least at a very broad level, was this unincorporated enterprises type of notion. And that's why there was so little of it in the developed country context. Okay. But as we move to a broader definition, which is that the enterprise can be incorporated and still have workers not paid there because of, and subcontracting and all that sort of stuff, okay? And it's that realization which has brought this forward in the developed country context as well. Okay, so I now want to move towards a discussion of some of the policy divergences. But before I do that, let me. Okay. So this is what we're talking. Internationally comparable measurement is, as I said, is transitioning now from an enterprise-based perspective to a worker-based perspective. These trends, by the way, that I talked about, are not because of this movement, not because of change in measurement. The trends are there even with this unincorporated enterprises definition. Okay. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not that I've now got a broader definition of informality. That's why informality is increasing. Okay? Even in terms of the old definition, it's increasing. But the strand of the literature which says we have to broaden our conceptualization of informality, okay, that is having an effect in the way the statistics are being generated now. So actually, we're now going to have to be careful in the years to come that when you're measuring informality, you're actually measuring the same thing at 2 points in time. Because the later measurements are likely to be increasingly these broader definitions of informality, and the earlier definitions are going to be the narrow definitions of informality. So that's another statistical thing we have to be careful of.
Question.
Yes.
Just for clarification, formal institution and informal institution, how is that related to your concept of formal and informal sector?
So again, these are very interesting questions. Okay? We could have a whole discussion on this. Let me just take the De Soto perspective. I'm actually critical of the De Soto perspective in my writings. You might have guessed. but let's think of it from the analytical point of view. Okay, I think there are at least two or three problems with it. One is exactly this notion that actually there is no order. This notion that there is no, on that side of the wall, there is no order. Okay. And that, of course, is problematic. Because indeed contracts are put in place, etc. They're not on paper, they're not on whatever and so on, but you know, contracts are indeed complied with and legs are broken and all sorts of things happen on that side of the wall. Okay. So that's one point. So the notion that somehow there was no order, there was no contracting going on in urban slums before this legal thing was extended, that's a problem. Okay. That's a problem from the point of view of actually a pure economic analysis, because you have to model that in order to work out what the impact is of introducing this legal structure over there. That's one point. So in some sense, even if one could show that this was beneficial of providing this legal platform, the formal legal platform from here to there, you would have to work out the true net benefits of that. Because in fact, these mechanisms that were there before were to some extent providing what is now being provided by this legal sector. Okay? So you have to distinguish between gross benefits and net benefits. That's one point. The second point I think is an equally important one, which is the distributional point. And this is actually revealed very clearly in studies that were done in Latin America of extending land rights, legal land rights, okay, which actually led to the worsening of position of non-Spanish speaking indigenous people. And it's very clear why. Okay? You introduce a legal system which is entirely based on the use of Spanish as a language. And if you're speaking Quechua, then that's it. Okay? So effectively, this is what critics have said, effectively what you did was that you introduced the power of the state to back up the landlords in this area. Before this happened, some sort of equilibrium had been reached, okay, between them. Some sort of equilibrium had been reached about squatting and this and that, etc. Now, with the view to introducing efficiency into the system, you actually introduce a system which provides the state's monopoly of force on the side of those who speak the language and can work the system. So those are my two criticisms which I've sort of written about. Yeah.
about, again, defining the concepts. Isn't it so problematic that we are trying to define informal, blah, blah, sector, job, employment, whatever it is, in opposition to the other concepts, like formal? State regulation, yes. So formal, no.
So I have mixed views on this broadening. Okay, I can see why people are doing it, and I don't mind so long as we're clear. Whenever somebody says informality, you should ask them the question, "What do you mean by it?" Okay. First of all, do you mean this or do you mean that? And you'll see that people mean whatever it is that they mean. Whatever it is that the mind picture that they have in their mind is what they're meaning when they say informal. So I think that I can see why this is being expanded, but I think it makes us, it increases the need for us to be extremely careful in the future in terms of these definitions. But in principle, I see nothing wrong with this thing. Okay, let's call this informality A, informality B, or whatever it is that you want to do, so long as we're clear as analysts as to what we mean by this. That's fine by me. My worry is that in the policy discourse, all these things get meshed up and mushed together. Yes. I'm not making great progress on my slides, but this is fine. It's perfectly fine. I'm not. Yeah, please.
Cambridge. So just one quick question to follow up on the previous one. This is hugely oversimplistic, but would it be fair to say that the mapping between the formal and informal economy and formal and informal institutions is that the formal economy is the one that is regulated by formal institutions, and the informal economy is the one regulated by informal institutions? Is that, I mean,
yes. I mean, yeah, leaving to one side how informal mechanisms work in formal institutions,
exactly,
etc., which again we can go into great detail. Yeah. So that's why I think let's just think of the following: identify a law or a regulation. The moment somebody says to you formality, you have to say to them, tell me what law and regulation relative to which you're talking about formality and informality. Identify that, at least conceptually, okay? Identify that. Then those activities that come under the ambit of that regulation are formal. Though relative to that regulation, those which are outside are informal. So if one has a law which says that all enterprises with more than 10 workers or more, have to register. Okay. Then, all those enterprises which have 10 workers or more and are registered are formal. All those enterprises which have more than 10 workers but are not registered are not formal.
Some registered, some not.
Yeah, but indeed, obviously they're illegal. Some are illegal, some are more than 10 workers but are not registered. Okay. Those enterprises which are 8 workers, but are not more than 10, therefore they don't need to register, are also informal. And I've now touched on a problem which I now want to go on to the next slide, which is that although formality is conceptually relatively clear, informality is 100% minus that. But there are many different types of informality, and that's what I want to come to.
Yeah, but is informality that conceptually clear? And why is the contract of employment being given so much of an emphasis in defining the formal economy? For instance, if you... In fact, specifically, it's registration. Okay? It's registration of the enterprise. Okay? In the first definition, the informal sector definition, in the first definition, which is the classical definition, which on the basis of which even now most cross-country statistics are produced, is the enterprise-based definition. Is the enterprise registered or not? Okay? But some people began to worry, actually arising out of concerns from the developed country context. Okay? Which is an enterprise can be 15 workers and registered, but half its workers don't get Social Security, which they're meant to. Okay. So they said, no, we want to quantify that phenomenon as well. Now, they could have used some other term for it, but they didn't, because informality has such a salience. They said, no, we're going to call this informality as well, except we're going to call it the informal workers, not workers in informal enterprises, but informal workers. Right, but what I'm getting at is that in following sort of Stuart Macaulay's train of literature, I mean, there are many aspects of the functioning of what we quite unambiguously define as formal enterprises that are substantively informal. I mean, there can be collusion between two major banks, which is an informally, agreed informally between the vice presidents of two banks, but the definition of formality don't touch on it at all.
Right. So I suppose this is why I was giving you some of the history of why it is that we came to how we came to in this thing. It was Boker, it was Lewis, it was Harris Todaro, it was. That's why we are where we are in this. Okay, so listen. Let me move on and try and actually. It's quite interesting because the questions you ask keep taking me to the next slide.
Can I ask what are the numbers?
No, not.
Well, here are the numbers.
So in the definition of the informal sector, you have own account workers and family helpers and so on and so forth. So would that mean that subsistence agriculture would come under there?
Okay. So now you're raising another issue, which is when we say that the share of the informal sector in the economy is X%, for example, those numbers there, are we including agriculture or not? That's a very interesting question. Typically, because it is so difficult to identify informality in the agricultural context, which law are you talking about, which whatever, there's no registration, and all that sort of stuff, okay? Quite typically, the numbers that we see are is informality, informal workers as a share of the non-agricultural workforce. So that's the other question you have to ask. When you say informality, do you mean informality of the economy as a whole, including agriculture, which is very important in a country like India, or do you mean non-agricultural workers? So, here are the figures from OECD. Okay? The share of the informal employment in total non-agricultural employment. And actually, it doesn't particularly matter. The trends are going to be relative. So here we are. Here are the rough numbers, okay? And the ranges and the rough averages as well. So you can see the cross-sectional relationships here as well. Okay? Economies with higher per capita income have lower shares of these as a cross-sectional phenomenon. What about the trends? So as I said, this is the old established regularity. In a cross-section, there's a negative relationship. However, in many countries, informality does not seem to decline at all. This is what I've been saying. Okay? And here are again some numbers for different countries: India, Egypt, Morocco, Guinea, etc.
And this is all non-agricultural.
Yes, it's a share of non.
Arjun Gupta report says 95%, 94%.
Yes. This is the 75 to 85, and this is 2000, whatever. Okay. And Arjun Sen Gupta's report had these two definitions: the informal sector and the informal workers as well. Okay? One has to be careful about that. A few percentage points is added when you go from the informal sector to the informal economy. Now, there are some, just to be fair, there are some sort of different results for different countries. And quite often what happens, I mean, we've been talking about conceptual things at a very broad level, okay? We say registration of an enterprise. Seems reasonable. But actually registration means very different things in different countries. What does it actually mean to register an enterprise in this country versus that country versus that country? Just because the English phrase says registration of enterprise, so we have to be very careful about those things as well. And some of these differences are as a result of these definitional things. But I think the presumption that informality will decline seems to be questioned now. And that's why I think it's become such an interesting, such a lively issue now in development. So, two questions. Why? And what can be done about it? What, if anything, can and should be done about it? So let me move to that. So consider the following simple framework, and I've already alluded to this. First of all, imagine a world without any laws and regulations, into which we're now going to introduce laws and regulations. And economic activity, the agents have to decide how to respond. For concreteness, I'm going to take the Indian case. consider a law which says that all enterprises with 10 or more workers have to register and then therefore pay certain benefits to workers, etc. Each enterprise has to decide what to do. And this creates several categories of activities.
Question here?
Yes.
So I was thinking that at the end of the day, an informal sector is also generating some form of income, and regulation in which they are required to pay benefits to workers might actually act as a disincentive to even start an enterprise.
So you've just stated a very important policy position of people like Arvind Panagaria and Jagdish Bhagwati and a number of people. Okay, and we're going to come to exactly that issue. Okay, in other words, the conclusion will be to remove that disincentive, loosen the regulation. It's because the regulation is so tight, okay, that firms are trying to get around it. Okay. Well, if you loosen that regulation, there will be less incentive to do that, and that is essentially part of the core of their argument. Yeah.
Can you maybe at one point link this last sentence with the previous speakers' doubt that rigid labour markets were in any case relevant? Because what you're speaking about is rigid labour markets, giving the disincentive, but as we just heard in the last lecture,
yes. No,
there are,
as you might expect, I'm very sympathetic to that perspective, and indeed we're going to come to that. We're going to come to that. But let's just think about this. Okay, this is very important. It creates, at least at this level of generality, the following 4 categories of activity, which you should always keep in your mind, I believe. Whenever somebody says informality to you, go into this mode. I think it certainly serves me well. Category A are those enterprises which are within the ambit of the law and are complying with the law. In other words, it's a 12-worker enterprise which is registering. Category B are those which are within the ambit of the laws but are not complying. There's a 15-worker firm which is not registering. C, those enterprises which have adjusted their activity to go outside the ambit of the law. In other words, an enterprise which would have been a 12-worker enterprise, but because of the regulation, decides to go under the radar and stay at 9 workers or 8 workers. That's category C. And category D is an enterprise which is always outside the owner count worker thing that you mentioned, a one-person enterprise, for whom, whether the regulation is set at 10 workers or 11 workers, is totally irrelevant. It always was a one-worker enterprise, always will be, etc. Okay. So these 4 categories, I believe, are very important in just keeping things straight when faced with this mess of the different strands of thinking and the strands of whatever, etc. First of all, ask the question, what is the law and regulation relative to which we are talking about formality and informality? In the Indian case, it's very clear, it's registration of enterprise. So then divide it up into these 4 categories. Does the law cover you and are you complying? Does the law cover you and you're not complying? Are you outside the ambit of the law because you've adjusted out? Because without the law, you wouldn't be on that side of the law. And finally, actually, you had no adjustment to make. You were always outside the ambit of the law, always will be, etc. And the point is that in the policy discourse, different people are focusing on these different segments. Their entire focus is on B, C, D, A, etc., etc., and they're talking across purposes. Yes, there was a question. Yes.
Do we have an estimation like how many, like what is the percentage of firms which like manipulate like at 12 or 13 and they are like, so we will see a clustering at 10 or 9. Like for
again, you jump 3 slides ahead, and the answer is that's the research program that I want to put before you. It is so important. These categories A, B, C, and D are so important in the discourse. Yet we have very little in the way of empirical estimates of how big these things are. That's one of my main points. Yes, please.
Clarification on D.
Yes.
Outside the ambit of the law, because the law does not recognize or know of them, and therefore is not captured in the definition.
No, sorry.
Or
No.
outside the ambit of the
Yeah,
law.
yeah. Let me be clear. Maybe that is unclear. So take the Indian case where it says 10 workers or more you have to register. Well, if I'm a one-worker enterprise, that's what I mean by being outside the ambit of the law. Yeah.
How about you have more than 10 workers?
Yeah.
But you're able to manage it in such a way that
That you don't register. That's B. See, you're within the ambit of the law, but you're not complying. You're not complying. That's illegality. Okay? And again, I'm jumping slides ahead, but my main point is that what we actually measure formally, statistically, is A. That's how what you get from your enterprise surveys, all that sort of stuff, okay? And informality is 100% minus A. In other words, it's B, C, and D. But we don't have estimates of B, C, D. The only thing we have an estimate of is B plus C plus D, which is 100% minus A. And the policy implications of B, C, and D, the policy perspectives, are very different. And everybody is using the entire sum, B plus C plus D, to back up their part of the policy dialogue. And you'll see what I mean when I yes.
I have a question. So, agriculture is sort of being entirely excluded at this point, or does it fit in under D?
Okay. So, at the moment, just for clarity, let's think at the moment, leave agriculture out for the moment, okay? Because it's difficult to think about how one's going to characterize a relation to what law in the agriculture context.
But so the concern is that, like, when we see the trends, right? You've had this huge portion of people out of agriculture into the non-agricultural sectors. So it could be the case that we actually don't see the downward trend in formality anyway. It's actually not necessarily formality. It's just that natives of the population are shifting people out of agriculture.
Again, a fair point. So there's that whole side of trying to explain why it is that this has happened. Okay, but if the trend is in informality, the share of the non-agricultural labor force, the share of, then you still have something to explain. Okay? You still have something to explain. Okay, so let me proceed and. So again, this is what I just said. A is formal, clearly. You're within the ambit of the law and you comply. B plus C plus D is what we typically get as informal. The number of 93% of the Indian workforce is informal, etc., etc. It's B plus C plus D.
And on the definition of A, compliance is full compliance.
Yes, yes. It's how do you do it? It's full compliance in the sense of registration, with registration. With registration.
The binary.
Registration, yeah. Okay. And again, the point is conceptually, you could apply this to 2 regulations or 3 regulations, etc. Although you would then be faced with the problem of how do you classify partial compliance. That's a conceptual problem. It's actually, you could do a very fine conceptual thing on it, but you won't get any numbers on it because statistically, all you're going to get is the number of enterprises who are registered and how many workers there are in it. That's all you're going to get from the numbers point of view. Again, there's household survey routes, etc. So, I don't want to hear from anybody that this is too simple a framework, okay? Of course I know this is too simple a framework. It's precisely because our thinking is so muddled, I think, with the different strands of the literature are present and everybody's jumping from one to the other, etc., that I think we need it to be simple. Just to be very clear. And of course I know that there are cross-linkages, blah, blah, blah. Okay, of course I know all that, okay? You don't need to tell me that. But the key point that I want to get across is that informality is of 3 types. There are the evaders, the avoiders, and the outsiders. The evaders are those, B, who are within the ambit of the law and are not complying. That's a 15-worker firm which is not registering. That's illegality, straightforward. C are the avoiders, who have actually taken a decision to stay under the radar screen. And D are the outsiders, who didn't have to take any decision. They were always one worker enterprise, always will be, etc. And the point is that the explanation of informality trends and policy discussion is going to have to disaggregate these. And my basic point is that we do not really have solid empirical estimates of the magnitudes of these different categories. All we have is ideology saying that this was what explains everything. It's because of the regulations that the entire B plus C is 93% because of the regulations. The other view is, it's 93% regulation, nothing to do with it at all. It's all to do with the own-account workers, the one woman with the sewing machine in the back, etc. Actually, it's all of these things. It's B plus C plus D. And we don't have reliable estimates of these things. And we might think about how, using standard statistical sources, we might begin to generate some estimates of these. Okay, so let me. I'll come back to trends actually. Let me talk about policy divides because this has come up a lot. So A, B, C, D. And my point is that B, C, and D need different theories, different policy analyses, different policy targeting, and yet we don't have a good enough breakdown in the data and a good enough theorizing of this. Yeah.
But before going on policy recommendations or policy advice, whatever, you just put the problem in terms of the enterprise-based
Okay.
So the policies will just regard this problem. If you just prefer to choose the informal employment definition and try to look at the problem from that aspect, you will most probably come through or just talk about collaboration, subcontracting,
But wait, let me.
global chains,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
So
let me go through this and come back to what the point that you're raising, okay? Because I think some things I said are going to be relevant to this. So let me just hold off on that for a minute. So here are two views. Here are two views on this informal. Now, just to be clear and sharp, I've kept it to the informal sector, the enterprise-based definition. But my contention is that something similar will have to be done for the other ways of looking at things as well. Okay? If you're going to keep things clean and straight, this is how you're going to have to think about these things. Okay? But here's something that The Economist said. Actually, it's a survey of Latin America. Thanks largely to Baroque regulation, half the labor force toils in the informal economy, unable to reap the productivity gains that come from technology and greater scale. This is actually a brilliant statement. It's a brilliant encapsulation of a particular perspective. Okay? It has a causal statement, thanks largely to Baroque regulation. It says it's because of the regulation that everything else follows. Half the labor force toils in the informal economy. B plus C plus D is 50% in Latin America. Remember the numbers that I gave you? It's roughly 50%. Okay. So they're saying the entire B plus C plus D is because of the regulation. And moreover, they have a consequences statement as well, which is that this part of the economy, because it is somehow forced to stay on this side, because of the regulations, is unable to reap the economies of scale, etc., etc. So, it's caused by regulation. The entire bit of informality is caused by regulation. And moreover, the consequence of it is low productivity, etc. And here, in some sense, is the counter to that, which is by Chen and Duane. Says labor market rigidities alone cannot explain the extent of informal employment. It's not the regulations, just is what they're saying. So, what's going on here? Well, what's going on is the following. Let me show this schematically. So, here we have firms which are within the ambit of the law and are compliant. That's the formal sector. And 100% minus that is typically measured as informal. But that is composed of those firms which are evading. And if you want to address that, you have to talk about enforcement. You have to talk about what is it that the government thinks it's doing when it's enforcing the law. Actually, what is it that the government thinks it's doing when it's not enforcing the law? What is it that the government thinks it's doing when it passes a law which it does not then enforce? We need a theory, actually we need a theory, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on if I have time. We need a joint theory of the regulation and the enforcement of that regulation. Because what we see, what we observe, is across countries that these regulations are not enforced. But it's not that they're not enforced at all. Enforcement rates are not 0%. Enforcement rates are not 100%. What's really interesting is that they're between 0% and 100%. And what's even more interesting is that they vary from country to country, from state to state in India, from time period to time period. Yeah. So what's the theory? Why is it that all of a sudden enforcement rates go up, go down, change? They're different in this country compared to that country, etc. Why is it that, is it the case, in fact, that there's a relationship between the stringency of the regulation and the extent of enforcement? Actually, how do we measure enforcement of laws? How do we actually measure enforcement of regulations? It's very difficult to do that in the enterprise law stuff. But there is a way of doing it for particular types of regulations. For example, minimum wage laws. I know I'm jumping a little bit around here, but the way that we can measure the degree of enforcement of minimum wage laws is that through labor force surveys. When you do labor force surveys, you ask, or household surveys, you ask the worker, what is your wage? You ask the worker, what is your job? You then code that according to employment, according to sector, occupation, location, etc., etc. Given that coding, you can match it with the gazetted laws, the gazette regulation, and say, this is what the wage should be. The wage should be no lower than this. When you match the two together, you then know whether the worker's wage is above or below. And the worker hasn't had to lie to you. The worker hasn't had to say to you, I'm in an enterprise that's breaking the law, etc. The worker doesn't know about all those things. The worker, you simply ask the survey question, what is your wage? What is your hourly wage, etc. But you also ask questions about the nature of the job, occupation, taxi driver, security worker, etc., etc. And then you know what the regulations are for that, and then you match them together. That's empirically the trick of it, matching the law, because the laws aren't necessarily written in the way that match with your statistical classifications. Okay? When you do that, you find, of course, that minimum wages aren't enforced 100%. But they're not enforced 0% either. See? And I think there's a whole, and I've written quite a few papers on this, there's a whole very interesting set of theorizing and empirical work done on this bit here. Okay. And again, there are two types of views on this enforcement business. One perspective is of 100% enforcement. Basically, those who are for the regulation and those who are against the regulation are both arguing on the assumption of 100% enforcement. Because, of course, if it was 0% enforced, then why would somebody support the regulation? And why would somebody want to oppose it? Because it's not enforced at all. So there's that perspective. The second perspective is 0% enforcement. Well, none of these things matter at all. My brother-in-law owns a restaurant, and the labor inspector comes every 3 months, and he pays him off, and that's it. He doesn't have to do it. Actually, empirically, it's somewhere in the middle. And that's what's interesting. It's somewhere in the middle, and it varies. And when countries change the level of the minimum wage, you also find that the enforcement of the minimum wage also changes. Which direction? Well, you have to think about what the theory might tell you. Yes?
I have one main question and possibly one follow-up, but when you talk about enforcement, do you mean self-enforcement or government?
Government enforcement.
Government enforcement.
Yes.
So then I'll have a follow-up question.
Yes.
How is this different from the ancient debate on criminal law?
Not different at all, except we have numbers now on the minimum.
Right, but that theory is Beccaria, and that stems from the Middle Ages.
So let me tell you. Let me maybe take 5 minutes to talk about some of the interesting aspects of this. Certainly, from an economist perspective, okay, the theory of enforcement, let's say of minimum wage enforcement, has been of the type where it says the minimum wage is given, and the government then chooses the enforcement intensity. Enforcement intensity is the probability of getting caught if you're whatever. Okay? And the government chooses that because there are certain costs. You have to put more labor inspectors, etc., etc. That's a Beckerian type perspective on the thing. But the answer to that question, how much you would, depends upon what minimum wage you've chosen. Okay. So actually, it's not a single instrument choice question, the way it is posed in the Becker framework. Okay, which is it's not that given the minimum wage, I'm trying to say how. It's a joint choice of the enforcement and the minimum wage, which is an altogether more intricate issue. You have to think to yourself, should I raise the minimum wage a little bit more, but enforce it a little bit less? What are the trade-offs involved in that? And a lot depends on how the market reacts. There's also an aspect, which again, this is sort of theory stuff, and you can have a look at our paper in the Economic Journal in 2010 on this thing. It's actually, the paper's called Turning a Blind Eye. It's a theory of turning a blind eye. And the idea is the following. It's a question of how can you credibly commit to enforcement. Actually, you can't, because you can always turn a blind eye. Okay. You can credibly commit, say in the Indian context, to a minimum wage, because it's gazetted. You can't gazette a minimum wage of 100 and then act as though it was 80. You'll be taken to the Supreme Court for it. But you can say what you like. You can say, I'm going to enforce this regulation really strictly. But when push comes to shove, you can always turn a blind eye. And the market knows that. So there's an additional complication about credibility of your announcements on your enforcement. So there's a whole theory of this as to what leads to this B in this thing, which is, because it's a long and ancient tradition, and Seneca had a lot to say about it and so on. I mean, I fully, but at least in terms of modern development economics, there's a fair bit going on in that literature. Okay, so that's B. That was just C and D are the crucial things that they did. The view of Arvind Panagaria, in my view, is that the entire problem is that these people have adjusted out. If only you could remove this regulation, all those 9-worker firms would suddenly become 15-worker firms. Okay? And they would then maybe hire some of these single own account workers, etc., etc. And in their view, the entire 93% is subject to that, is caused by that. Remember the Economist statement, thanks to Baroque regulation, half the labor force toils in the informal sector. Now, what we had are studies of the impact of regulation on adjusting in and out. That we do for sure. It's controversial. But whatever the analysis of whether or not these regulations lead to a move in this direction, and I think it would be very surprising if they didn't. Okay? Let's be very clear about this thing. Okay? It's not a question. It's a question of the magnitude of this impact. Okay? I think it would be silly of us. It would be silly of us to say that if I introduce a regulation requirement, then I impose a cost on that, that's not going to have an effect on incentives of the firm. That would just be silly. Okay? The question is, what's the magnitude? What's the empirical magnitude of that? And moreover, how far into this does it stretch? And on that, we don't have any evidence. That's my basic contention. On that, we don't have any evidence. On this side here, the sort of Chen Duane type view is that whatever your views on this is irrelevant to over here. For the next 15, 20 years, we're going to need to focus on this problem. This issue will be with us for the next 15 to 20 years. And what we should be doing is investing in training, providing better quality sewing machines to the women who are doing garment work in their homes, and so on. And so you can see the policy divide here. For groups like WIGO and SEWA, whatever their view of on this boundary, on this margin, it pales in their view, it pales in comparison, in significance, to the magnitude of this problem. And in their view, all this discussion over here essentially takes the oxygen out of the room, leaving very little policy capital to invest at this end of the informal sector. But we actually don't know empirically what the signs are. We tried some ways, thought of some ways in which we could identify these enterprises. What might be the naturally informal sector, so to speak? In other words, an enterprise which would not jump to being formal if the regulation was relaxed. Suppose the enterprise was operating, suppose its place of operation was the home. Suppose it did not use electricity. Well, it seems to me that's probably a reasonable, we could draw a reasonable conclusion that if you change the registration requirement from 10 workers to 11 workers, nothing would happen in that enterprise. Well, actually, you might be able to get estimates of that type from the Indian sources. But nobody's done that. So here are the questions that I've been talking about. How big is B plus C relative to D? What exactly is the impact of specific laws? How do changes in technology, this is your point, how do changes in technology, global trading conditions shift the balance between B, C, and A? And here's a point that I just want to emphasize, another point that I've been trying to convince Joe of, but not succeeding fully as yet. Which is, and this is again a research question for you guys. Could it be, see, why is it that B plus C plus D is increasing? Well, it could be that enforcement is getting more lax. Although that can have two effects. Okay? But it could be enforcement. Well, there's probably some evidence for that. It could be that regulation is getting more lax. But actually, regulation getting more lax might go in the other direction and so on. Again, so there are these different effects. But what if the following is true? Given regulation, given enforcement of regulation, technology is moving in such a way that operation at smaller scale is less costly than it used to be, is more viable than it used to be. Okay. Now previously, when you had to think to yourself, shall I stay at 8 rather than go to 16? You had to think really hard. Okay. Because to have a generator, have a power generator, a small power generator was very, very expensive. So in order to meet that cost, so to speak, you would rather operate at 16 or way down below. Now, operating at 8 is more viable because generators have become less costly. I'm just throwing these ideas out, okay? So a basic thought that I have is that one of the reasons why we have this trend in informality, given that we measure it as essentially small-scale enterprises, is that technology is evolving in such a way that operating at smaller scale is less costly, is more viable than it used to be 20 years ago. Again, we have no studies, no evidence, no analysis of this whatsoever, but it strikes me as being a wide open area for research. Let me make another observation, going back to the urbanization, link between urbanization and informalization. Here's a very interesting piece of evidence for India. Take standard definitions of urban according to the census definitions and so on. Take standard definitions of formality and informality according to the 10 workers, etc., etc. Well, we know that urbanization is happening. We know that informalization is happening. But something that's very interesting is that informal enterprises seem to be moving into urban areas, and formal enterprises seem to be moving out of urban areas. In other words, small enterprises, this is dynamics now, okay? Small enterprises, not panels, this is sort of a cross-section, small-scale enterprises, which is how we define informality, are moving into congested urban areas. Large-scale enterprises, which are defined as formal, more than 10 are moving out of urban areas. Yes.
Would that suggest that there are agglomeration concepts
Thank you.
much more than...
Now, this is one for which I don't have a slide, but in fact it is exactly that. So and how does agglomeration agglomeration economy. How does this relate to agglomeration economy and so on? Anyway, there's an interesting research question for you. Why is it, or rather, how do we make sense of, or what does it mean that in the Indian context, small-scale enterprises, this is over the last 20 years, are moving into urban areas, and large-scale enterprises are moving out of urban areas. So here's a sequence of thought, here's a sequence of points which might link these things together. One is that as urban rents increase, as land rents increase, okay, that can be a penalty for larger scale enterprises. Holding everything else constant, that's a penalty for large enterprises. Secondly, to the extent that larger scale enterprises are already, in some sense, vertically integrated, more likely to be vertically integrated. The cloth goes in this end, the shirt comes out that end. Okay? Already, several processes. That's what means by being large. Okay, in that context. On the other hand, small scale enterprises are not going to be vertically integrated. Okay? You cut the cloth, sew the thing, sew the buttons on, sew the labels, etc., etc. The cluster-based thing. In fact, it's for the less vertically integrated enterprises that agglomeration externalities are, that density and agglomeration are going to be important. If you have everything that you need for your factory under one roof, and land rents are rising, you just move to a greenfield site over there. There's some loss to you from not having the last backward link and the next forward link. Okay. But it's not that great. On the other hand, a small-scale enterprise would want to be next to its suppliers at the back and the forward of the chain. So in some sense, agglomeration-type arguments, agglomeration externalities type arguments, might actually support this. We have a finding, we have an empirical finding of this type. The question is, how do we explain it? And what does it mean? Let me make I think I have 2 more minutes. Actually, I won't make the point about. So, let me go back to my point about A, B, C, D, and I want to conclude with this. The policy question is the following: if the objective is greater sustainable impact on poverty, then is it a higher priority to use limited financial, administrative, and political resources to raise productivity amongst the outsiders, D, or 2, reforming regulations to reduce adjustments out of A into C? That is the policy question that we face. We have limited political capital, we have limited financial capital. How do we deploy that? Okay. Where are we going to get the biggest bang for the buck? We have one group of people who argue to focus on 2. We have another group of people who are arguing focusing on 1. I think, as I say, I think many elements of civil society would say 1. I think the economists would say 2. But what I do know is that we do not have sufficient research to provide the answer with confidence. And that's up to you guys to take it to the next step. Thank you very much. All these papers and so on are on my website. You just go and
Well, let's keep it. We're running out of time, and we've had a lot of discussion and questions. We'll take a couple of questions. A few people had raised hands, and then Okay. Ravi, we'll take the three together, shall we? Yes, Ravi.
So Ravi, my name is Seema. I am a faculty in the university. My question was, does seem what disadvantageous, if not derogatory? Well, to my experience, however limited it is in the Indian empirical research context, it's somewhat evident. And there are emerging publications which shows that at least among some workers within the informal workers of which constitutes D, there is a preference to be in D, to remain in D. For example, one would choose to do n number of things within D. When you move from D to B, C, or A, you have to be categorized as one particular livelihood worker. Rather than that, some of our studies show that people actually have a preference and it provides them with viable livelihood throughout the year to be diversified within D but remain in D.
Yeah. So let me again. So in terms of the D category, so I want to distinguish between the D category and what I call the C category. In other words, the ones who have adjusted out, who have obviously clearly shown a preference for this sector. Otherwise, by definition, they're avoiding the regulation. If the regulation hadn't been there, there would have been. And distinguish that from D, for whom, in some sense, the regulation is irrelevant, is completely irrelevant over there. Okay. So if you're referring to, say, the own account worker who is making agarbattis or whatever in her front room, or making fireworks in her front room, or whatever. Okay. So in some sense, it's not clear what's meant by preference there, because this lady couldn't be setting up a 10-worker enterprise anyway. Okay. The real issue, I think, arises for the 8 or 9-worker enterprise, where the person is just lying below, and that's the empirical question. The empirical question is, if that regulation wasn't there, would they then expand? And let me propose that as a research topic too, which is one can go to the own account workers, but I think that will confirm what Vigo and others are saying. But where I think the real empirical nub of this is going to be is at the margin of the 7-8 worker enterprise. If one can show by empirical work that actually changing that cutoff, say from 10 to 12, which is what people are arguing for, 10 to 15 or whatever it is, okay, or even removing it. If one can show that that's going to have a big effect or not a big effect, I think that will be a very important input into policy in this. Right.
There are two more questions.
You is my student to call out others. Okay. No difficult questions, please.
So my question is still about the C and D category. I think empirically it's very difficult to separate the two groups, right? Because you don't know whether the C group intentionally want to stay out shorter.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is why I'm throwing it to you. Okay. So here's how I would pose the question. Take 2 9-worker enterprises. Remember, 10 is the cutoff. Okay. Take 2 9-worker enterprises, and imagine that the regulation is lifted. Which of those 2 would jump to being 12 workers? Okay. And which of those 2 would stay at 9? Okay. And there are some, at least, empirical techniques to have the propensity score management. There are different ways in which one can get at this sort of thing. There's also some sort of hack to do some experimental things and so on this as well. But I think that is the question that I think is analytically interesting. It's analytically challenging, precisely because of the difficulties of getting this in. And also, I think it could have a big impact on the policy domain. Yes, and then, well, yeah, please.
It's just a miracle we solved this problems that you imposed to us, both statistical measurements and the policies implication for it. We're just talking about one policy here, right? And formal enterprise and informal enterprise. Within the economies, we're dealing with a huge number of problems that is much more sophisticated. How do you enforce intellectual property rights, for example, or issue that is a lot harder to measure? My question is, assuming that we found the answer for your problem now, whether or not that answer will in some way similar to the potential answers that we will need for other problems.
Okay, well, let me start first of all that this problem, and the reason why I chose to speak about it here, is a growing problem. It's in terms of levels, it's a big problem in some countries. India is an example. In terms of rate of change, it's getting a big problem in other countries, including in developed countries. So this problem, this type of thinking, this type of clarification, this type of analysis is going to be needed. So that's point one. Now, I didn't fully understand the intellectual property rights type thing, but to the extent you're talking about enforcement.
Well, because you define informality, or when you say, when someone talks about informality, the first thing we should ask is what law?
Yes.
Right? And so there are
what's the definition?
Number of laws that are out there per country.
What I should have said is, what's your definition? When somebody says informality, you should say, what is your definition of informality? And you'll be surprised how many people don't know the answer to that question when they just use the word informality themselves. Okay? Mm-hmm. And the one that I would buy is when they said, what I mean is registered enterprises or whatever. But then I would say, but in these two countries, does registration mean the same, et cetera, et cetera? One could peel away at those questions. So I guess what I'm trying to get across is a method of thinking about these things. And the issue of if you have sorry, Upper, I know you're
no.
So if you have several regulations, actually that's a very interesting analytical problem as well. If you have 3 regulations and the firm is deciding to comply with one or more, which one will it comply with? Which one should it comply with? Okay. In Mexico, for example, in Mexico, in India, if you have more than 10 workers, you have to register. In Mexico, if you have even 1 worker, you have to register for Social Security. Or if you have 1,000 workers. But amongst 1,000 worker firms, there are some firms who register 700 of their workers. Other firms register 600 of their workers. Other firms register 500 of their workers. Why? That's not it.
Can we no, please? I don't want to eat too much into the next session. So.
Hopefully, but if you can help one another, let me know. It's really hard. It's really nice to meet you. They never help.